very warm welcome to the Ramsay Centre's online lecture series for 2020, our journal of the plague year, as Defoe might have said, except that the sense of impending threat so many people seem to be feeling this year does go beyond the grim medical situation and the dire economic outlook to a place that's perhaps more Camus than Defoe, to something more like the existential or civilizational level. And that is what our distinguished speaker today will be talking about. That is how the undoing of Western civilization seems not so much to alarm, but actually to appeal to so many people in the West, and why it's so important to get ourselves out of this frame of mind. Professor Andrew Roberts is a most eminent British biographer and historian. As well as an acclaimed history of the Second World War, he has written prize-winning lives of Lord Salisbury, Napoleon, and most recently, Winston Churchill. This being a book which has been called the best one-volume biography of Churchill yet written. Professor Roberts is the Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's the Lerman Institute Distinguished Lecturer at the New York Historical Society, and he's a visiting professor at the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. He's a fellow of both the Royal Society of Literature and the Royal Historical Society. So no one is better qualified to address the topic he's chosen to speak to us about. So here is Professor Andrew Roberts on why we must believe in Western civilization.
On Tuesday, December the 3rd, 1940, Winston Churchill read a memorandum by the military strategist Basil Littleheart, which advocated making peace with Nazi Germany. This argued that otherwise Britain would soon see, quote, Western Europe racked by warfare and economic hardship, the legacy of centuries in art and culture swept away, the health of the nation dangerously impaired by malnutrition, nervous strains and epidemics, Russia profiting from our exhaustion. Churchill nevertheless courageously concluded that we should be wrong to hesitate in rejecting any negotiation with Adolf Hitler. It's illuminating, especially in our own time of nervous strains and epidemics, that in that list of horrors, the fear of losing the legacy of centuries of art and culture rated above almost everything else. For Churchill, the prospect of losing the legacy of Western civilization was worse even than succumbing to the hegemony of the Soviet Union. Yet today, 8 decades later, we have somehow reached a situation in which Sonali Rashatwa, who is described by the Philadelphia Inquirer as a fat positivity activist and Instagram therapist, can tell that newspaper, quote, I love to talk about undoing Western civilization because it's just so romantic to me. How have we come this far? For Ms. Rashatwa and the cohorts who genuinely want to undo Western civilization are now succeeding where Adolf Hitler and the Nazis failed. The evidence is rampant in the academy, where a preemptive cultural cringe is decolonizing college syllabuses. That is, wherever possible, removing dead white European males from it, often with overt support from deans and university establishments. Western civilization courses, insofar as they exist under other names, are routinely denounced as racist, phobic, and generally so unwoke as to deserve axing. Western civilization, so vital to our forefathers' sense of who they were and what they existed to promote, is being ridiculed, abused, and marginalized, often without any coherent response. Of course, today's non-Western colonizations, such as India's in Kashmir and China's in Tibet and its exterminationist war against the Uyghurs, are not included in the sophomore's concept of imperialism and occupation, which can only ever be done by the West. The Amritsar massacre only ever refers to the British in the Punjab in 1919, for example, rather than the Indian massacre of 10 times the number of people there in 1984. Nor can the positive aspects of the British Empire even be debated any longer, as the closing down of Professor Nigel Biggar's conferences in Oxford eloquently demonstrates. We all know the joke that Mahatma Gandhi supposedly made when he was asked what he thought about Western civilization. I think it might be a good idea. The gag's apocryphal, in fact, first appearing 2 decades after his death. But many, very, very many people have taken it literally, arguing that there really is no such thing as Western civilization. From ideologues such as Noam Chomsky to the activists of the Rhodes Must Fall movement at Oxford University, who succeeded in pulling down the statue of the benefactor of the Rhodes Scholarships from Oriel College. Increasingly clamorous demands by African and Asian governments for the restitution of artifacts supposedly stolen from their countries during colonial periods are another aspect of this attack, an attempt to guilt shame the West, even though the taking of booty has been seen in every single war throughout history. This belief that Western civilization is at heart uniquely morally defective has recently been exemplified by the New York Times' inane and wildly historically inaccurate 1619 project, which essentially attempts to present the entirety of American history from the Plymouth Rock to today solely through the prism of race and slavery. America wasn't a democracy until Black Americans made it one, was the headline of one essay in the New York Times magazine launching the project, alongside American capitalism is brutal, you can trace that to the plantation, and how segregation caused your traffic jam. When no fewer than 12, in the circumstances very brave, American Civil War historians sent a letter itemizing all the myriad factual errors in the project's founding document, the New York Times refused to publish it. Yet the project plans to create and distribute school curricula that will recenter America's memory. None of this would amount to much if only schools and colleges in Britain, America, Australia, and across the English-speaking peoples were not so keen to apologize for and deny Western civilization, or to abolish or dumb down the teaching of important aspects of it. The classics faculty at Oxford University, to take one example of many, has recently recommended that Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid be removed from the syllabus in ancient literature, history, and philosophy, giving as their reason the difference in recent exam results between male and female undergraduates, and the difference in expertise in Latin and Greek between privately and publicly educated students. One of the supposed guardians of the discipline are therefore willing to put social experimentation before the best possible teaching of the humanities, a disgraceful position to have been adopted by Britain's second best university. Yet instead of apologizing for Western civilization, we should still believe in it, be proud of it, and proselytize it. For all that we must of course take proper cognizance of other cultures in terms of both its sheer quality and its quantity, the legacy of the Western one is unsurpassed in human history. We're deliberately underplaying the greatest contributions made to poetry, architecture, philosophy, music, and art by ignoring that fact, often simply in order to try to feel less guilty about imperialism, colonialism, and slavery, even though the last was a moral crime committed by only a minority of some few people's great-great-great-grandparents. As a result, future generations cannot be certain that they will be taught about the overwhelmingly positive aspects of Western civilization. They might not now be shown the crucial interconnection between, for example, the chapel by Giotto at Padua, which articulates the complex scholasticism of St. Augustine in paint, Machiavelli's The Prince, the first work of modern political theory, Botticelli's Primavera, the quintessence of Renaissance humanism in a single painting, the works of Teresa of Aquila and Descartes, which wrestle with the proof of discrete individual identity, Beethoven's symphonies, arguably the most complex of profound orchestral works ever written, and Shakespeare, whose plays Harold Bloom has rightly pointed out, quote, remain the outward limit of human achievement, aesthetically, cognitively, in certain ways morally, even spiritually. Even if they are taught about these things individually, they will not be connected in a context that makes it clear how important they are to Western civilization. We cannot therefore know that once the present campaign against Western civilization reaches its goal, what our children and grandchildren will be taught about the living thing that intimately connects Europe's Gothic cathedrals, which are meditations in stone between the individual and the sublime, the giants of the 19th century novel from Dickens to Flaubert to Tolstoy, where contemporary life realistically observed becomes a fit subject for art. The Dutch masters of the 17th century, such as Rembrandt, who wrestled visually with the human condition in a fashion which still speaks to us across the centuries. Versailles, the Hermitage, and the Alhambra, which, though bombastic, are undeniably ravishing expressions of the human will. Faced with the argument that Western culture is no longer relevant, it's tempting to adopt Dr. Samuel Johnson's argument, aim a good kick at the nearest neoclassical building and announce, I refute it thus. Mention of the Alhambra in Granada prompts the thought that any course in Western civilization worth its name ought also to include the Umayyad Caliphate, of which Cordoba in modern-day Spain was the capital between 756 and 929 AD. In the wake of the conquest of Spain and the establishment of the Muslim Confederacy, Cordoba became a flourishing, polyglot, multicultural environment in which religious tolerance, despite Jews and Christians being obliged to pay a supplementary tax to the state, produced an atmosphere of intellectual progressiveness, which made it one of the most important cities in the world. Discoveries in trigonometry, pharmacology, astronomy, and surgery can all be traced back to Cordoba. At a certain point then, a very particular set of historical circumstances produced an equally particular set of intellectual ideas, which had significant material consequences. The study of Western civilization is therefore emphatically not solely that of Christian dead white European males. What the old Western Civ university courses did, really, was to root a people in their past and their values. The trajectory of modern culture was shown to have run from Greece via Rome to Christendom, infused by Judaic ideas and morality along the way via Jerusalem, but then detouring briefly through the Dark Ages, recovering in the Renaissance, which led to the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and thus the scientific, rational, and politically liberated culture of Europe and European America, Australia, and the English-speaking peoples, from Plato to NATO, as the catchphrase went. At the very center of this transference of values across time and space was democracy, of which Winston Churchill famously said, many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms that have been tried from time to time. The generations who grew up knowing that truth, rather than weltering in guilt and self-doubt about false consciousness and so on, were the lucky ones, because they were allowed to study the glories of Western civilization in a way that was unembarrassed, unashamed, and not saddled with accusations of guilt in a centuries-old crime that has absolutely nothing to do with them, i.e. slavery. They could learn about the best of their civilization and how it benefited and continues to benefit mankind. As Ian Jenkins, the senior curator of the ancient Greek collection at the British Museum, put it in his book on the Elgin marbles, somewhat politically correctly entitled The Parthenon Sculptures, quote, human figures in the frieze are more than mere portraits of the Athenian people of the day. Rather, they represent a timeless humanity one which transcends the present to encompass a universal vision of an ideal society. The Parthenon itself set out the architectural laws of proportion, which still obtain to this day. And later in the book, Jenkins points out how the sculptures transcend national boundaries and epitomize universal and enduring values of excellence. It was no coincidence that interest in them permeated the Western Enlightenments of the 18th century. While the Parthenon was being built, Pericles contrasted the openness and moderation of Athenian civic life with the militaristic, secretive, dictatorial Spartans in his great funeral speech of 430 BC. And this struck a chord with the Enlightenment thinkers of 23 centuries later, just as it should continue to with us today, reminding us why Western values are indeed superior to those that actuate the leaders of modern China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and also, of course, Zimbabwe. And yes, we know that the architect Phidias employed slaves and Metic foreigners in building the Parthenon, not just Athenian freemen. Carved around the middle of the 5th century BC, writes Neil MacGregor, former director of the British Museum, the Elgin marbles, quote, are a product of a creative culture that is credited with the invention of such aspects of modern Western civilization as democracy, philosophy, history, medicine, poetry, and drama. Of course, no one is claiming for a moment that ancient Oriental, Persian, and Arab civilizations did not have all of those listed, except democracy, which they did not then, and most still do not today. And no one suggests that South Sea Islanders, the Aztecs and Incas, ancient Egyptians, or the Khmer Empire that built Angkor Wat for the god Vishnu, did not have their own worthy civilizations too. Yet even the very greatest achievements and physical creations of those other civilizations simply cannot compare with what the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian Western civilization has produced in philosophy, history, medicine, poetry, and drama, let alone democracy. Anyone reading Charles Murray's superb and unanswerable book, Human Accomplishment, cannot but accept that the contribution made to mankind, the whole of it, not just the West, by dead white European males, has statistically utterly dwarfed that made by the whole of the rest of the world combined. This is demonstrable in terms of its cathedrals, concertos, Nobel Prizes, medical breakthroughs, and the fact that there is no one in any other civilization who can objectively match the sheer body of poetic and dramatic work of Shakespeare. To deny that is to start going down the route of the 19th dictator of Chad, who was reduced to claiming that the light bulb, television, and telephone were all invented there. From the Constitution drafted by the founding father of the American Republic to the wartime speeches of Winston Churchill, Jenkins writes, many have found inspiration for their brand of human liberalism and for a doctrine of the open society in the funeral speech of Pericles. If Pericles had lost an election or was ostracized in the annual vote of the Athenians, he would have stood down from office in the same way that Boris Johnson, Angela Merkel, Scott Morrison, and Emmanuel Macron would after a defeat in a free and fair election in their countries. Whereas that is inconceivable in many totalitarian countries not infused by the ethics of the West. That is ultimately why we should still believe in Western civilization, not apologize for it, why it should be proselytized around the world and certainly taught as a discrete discipline in our schools and universities. The West never pretended that it invented civilization, as the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss emphasized in his 1951 foreword to the UNESCO International Social Science Bulletin. Considering some of the most ancient sites of human habitation in the world, such as Harappa in the Indus Valley, he observed straight streets intersecting at right angles, individual industrial workshops, utilitarian housing for workers, public baths, drains and sewers, pleasant suburbs for the wealthier classes. In short, what he called all the glamour and blemishes of a great modern city. 5,000 years ago, therefore, the most ancient civilizations of the old world were giving their lineaments to the new. The inhabitants of Egypt, China, and Persia were creating sophisticated art and architecture, legal and numerical systems, literary and musical traditions, while the people of Europe were still covered in woad and living in mud huts. What might Homer have to say about being civilized? The Iliad, which describes the clash between the Greeks and the Trojans, is not a description of a conflict between two nation states. Adam Nicholson characterizes the conflict in The Mighty Dead, Why Homer Matters, as the deathly confrontation of two ways of understanding the world. In this 4,000-year-old scenario, the Greeks are the barbarians. They are northern warriors, newly technologically empowered with ships and bronze spears, who want what the Trojans have got. They're pirates, coarse, animalistic, in love with violence. They're savage, rootless nomads who trade women as commodities. A three-legged metal tripod to put vases on is worth 12 oxen, a woman only 4. And lust after the treasure hidden within Troy's walls. The city of Troy is wealthy, ordered, graceful, stable, and the Greeks want it. In the climax of the poem, Achilles, the ultimate man of the plains, confronts Hector of Troy, the man of the city. In disarmingly exhilarating and violent poetry, the outsider slaughters the insider. The barbarians have won. Or have they? After the battle, Priam, Hector's grieving father, visits Achilles in his tent. Troy is doomed, but Achilles marvels at Priam's humility, at his ability to respect the man who has murdered his beloved son. From the mutuality and courage of that wisdom, writes Nicholson, its blending of city and plain, a vision of the future might flower. The Crusaders of medieval Europe were no more bloody and cruel than the wars of conversion enacted by the expanding Islamic world in the 7th and 8th centuries. The Ethiopian Empire, 1270 to 1974, was founded upon slavery, as well as the Ottoman Empire, 1922 to 1924. If the history of the West needs to be taught critically, then so does that of the East, or the so-called global South. No civilization has been morally pure. Competition and monopoly, writes Neil Ferguson sagely in his book Civilization, The West and the Rest, science and superstition, freedom and slavery, curing and killing, hard work and laziness, in each case the West has been the father to both the good and the bad. Those early Western civ courses never tried to argue that it was flawless. Karl Marx sometimes used to be taught in them after all. But in the 20th century, students had better common sense and took that for granted, and were not looking for ever new ways to be offended. Christianity, for all its schisms and intolerance, its occasional obscurantism and obnoxious iconoclasm, has been overall an enormous force for good in the world. The Sermon on the Mount was, as Churchill put it, the last word in ethics. Christians abolished slavery in the 1830s, or 3 decades later in America's case, whereas outside Christendom, the practice survived for much longer, and identifiable versions of it still exist in some non-Christian and anti-Christian countries today. The abolition of slavery did not merely happen by votes in Parliament and proclamations from presidents. It was fought for, by and against, Christians with much blood spilt on both sides. That would not have happened without the Judeo-Christian values that are so central to Western civilization. The Royal Navy ran its West Africa Preventive Squadron for over 60 years, with the sole task of fighting slavery, during which time it freed about 160,000 slaves, and an estimated 17,000 British seamen died achieving that. When considering the rest, those civilizations that did not produce what Western civilization has, Neil Ferguson is unblushingly honest. We must resist the temptation to romanticize history's losers, he writes. The other civilizations overrun by the West's, or more peacefully transformed by it through borrowings as much as by impositions, were not without their defects either, of which the most obvious was that they were incapable of providing their inhabitants with any sustained improvement in the material quality of their lives, unquote. For all my earlier concentration on art and architecture, poetry and music, Ferguson is also correct to point out that, quote, civilization is much more than just the contents of a few first-rate art galleries. It is a highly complex human organization, which is why his book is about as much about sewage pipes as flying buttresses. In response to the issuing of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1947, the American Anthropological Association released a critique which asked, how can the proposed declaration be applicable to all human beings and not be a statement of rights conceived only in terms of the values prevalent in the countries of Western Europe and America? The question assumes that the 30 articles of the Declaration could not be universal, since universality of human rights was of necessity a Western assumption. That this was intended as a criticism, of course, not an endorsement. Yet the West has not stolen these values as the Greeks stole the Trojans' gold. It has not appropriated or co-opted them. Rather, they are seen as objectionable because they do indeed, according to their detractors, inhere in Western culture. So given that a belief in human rights is apparently predicated on Western culture, is not that culture worth examining and teaching? Instead, there's an entire industry devoted to trying to topple dead white European males and heroes of them from their pedestals, literally so. In the case of the British activist Afua Hirsch's attempt to have Admiral Nelson removed from his column in Trafalgar Square in London on the grounds that he did not actively campaign to abolish the slave trade, which wasn't abolished by Britain until 2 years after his death. The self-hatred virus is a particularly virulent and infectious one, and has almost entirely overtaken the Academy in its attitude towards Western civilization. Once again, Charles Murray is invaluable here in enumerating in numbers and places and names and statistics the contribution made in every field by Jews over the millennia, around 100 times what it ought to be in relation to their demographical numbers on the planet. Writing of Max Warburg's daughter Gisela in his book The Warburgs, Ron Chernow recalls how, once asked at a party whether she was Jewish, Gisela refused to answer. When her mother asked her why, Gisela stammered confusedly, "You always told us not to boast." That might be true of her, but Philo-Semitic Gentiles like me enjoy boasting about the contributions the Jews have made to Western civilization in every sphere. Beware the hater of Western civilization. Very often there's an anti-Semite not very far away. French postmodern theory refuses to distinguish between high and low culture, attempting to make it futile even to discuss whether this or that work of art is or is not lovely or important. If you want to argue that Kanye West's lyrics are as good as Shakespeare or Mongolian yurts are as valid a form of architecture as the Sydney Opera House, then Foucault will support you all the way. But if you want to understand why we do not have child slavery in the West, or disenfranchised women, or imprisonment without trial, or the imprisonment of newspaper editors, you simply have to study the cultural history that produced such an unusual and extraordinary situation in human history. It's inescapable and not susceptible to postmodernist analysis. It's not about the aesthetic or literary superiority of certain artworks, but about the unequivocal good of human dignity. If Ms. Sonali Rachatois really finds the idea of losing her human rights so romantic, she's always welcome to move to Saudi Arabia, which is still awaiting its enlightenment. The very great late Gertrude Himmelfarb identified 3 separate enlightenments, English, French, and Scottish, at different though overlapping stages of the 18th century, with different emphases in different places at different times. Chartres Cathedral was not dedicated until 1260, so there were 5 centuries between then and the Enlightenments. But they were the moment that people began to throw off superstition and a belief in magic and witchcraft, to look at the world afresh, unafraid of what they might find and where it might take them, even at the risk of unbelief. If the Islamic world had had such a moment, it would not have been left behind in so many areas of accomplishment since it was turned back from the gates of Vienna in 1683, with the result that its fascist fundamentalist wing not have existed to lash out in such fury and resentment on 9/11. The recent security conference in Munich took as its theme and title Westlessness, an ugly word in English, worse in German, intending to prompt international decision makers into thinking what might happen if the Trump administration were ever to get as tough over NATO underfunding as it has long threatened to do. Another fear of Westlessness, however, should be about the eclipse of Western civilization as a subject for study, as a result of a hugely successful Gramscian march through the institutions. For far becoming a kumbaya, touchy-feely place, a truly Westless world would be a neo-Darwinian free-for-all, in which every state merely grabbed what it could, a return to the world Hobbes wrote about in Leviathan. The left should beware what it claims to wish for. Western civilization should be taught once more in our schools and colleges. For as Churchill knew as the bombs were falling and London was burning in December 1940, it is still worth believing it. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure you found that lecture as challenging and as thought-provoking as I did. There will have been things you agreed with, or things you disagreed with, or others you hadn't thought of at all. But surely the idea of a Westless world is indeed both frightening and somewhat incoherent. And addressing this idea is a key part of our remit at the Ramsay Centre. Many thanks to Professor Andrew Roberts for that wonderful lecture. As our plague year continues, do watch out for more of our online lectures, including by such luminaries as Ita Buttrose, Bettany Hughes, Peter Baldwin, Noel Pearson, and Lionel Shriver. And meanwhile, thank you for listening. Stay safe, and if you can, stay cheerful, and see you next time.